Greetings, viewers. So, picking up where we left off, we stopped at the end of the First World War. We'll start with the beginning of Chapter 3, the 1916-1922 uprisings. So what happens after the end of the First World War is that the unintended consequences of a planetary war come home to roost in the form of a massive wave of anti-colonial and anti-imperial uprisings. They shatter the Austrian, German, Ottoman, and Romanov empires, four of the biggest land empires on the planet, ripped apart, become the site of innumerable conflicts. A total of about 41 of these uprisings occur, two continental-sized civil wars, and the net result is the creation of 13 post-dynastic polities after all the dust settles. Many uprisings try to create polities, but they're crushed, suborned, failed, or put down. But the ones that do succeed creating new structures, and I'll just list them briefly. They're mostly in one part of the world. There's good reason for that. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Hungary, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Turkey, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. So most of these are the former members or former regions of the Austrian, German, and Romanov empires. And of course, Ireland, the former British Empire, gets its independence in 1923. But this was a truly planetary wave, and very different, actually, from the previous wave of planetary uprisings in 1848-1851, so-called Springtime of the Nations. The 1848 uprisings were mostly limited to continental Europe. There were numerous, many of them occur in most places in Europe, but it was mostly the European continent, a couple places outside, and therefore was regionalized or localized to that extent. 1916-1922 is truly planetary, and rebellions occur from Burkina Faso in Africa, all the way in Seoul, Korea, Japanese colony at the time, to the May 4th anti-imperial movement in China against the Japanese imperial occupation of China. All the way to the multiple revolutions that break out all across Eastern Europe and Western Asia. So this is all across the world. And there's even an echo in the Americas in the form of the Mexican Revolution of 1911-1920. It breaks out in 1911, just prior to the World War, but the events of the World War actually exacerbate and intensify the internal contradictions of the Mexican Revolution. One of the great innovations, political innovations, that comes out of this period is the appearance of the first national peasant armies. These had existed. The Haitian independence movement of 1804 had witnessed a peasant mobilization, and parts of the Atlantic revolutions had national peasant armies. But something new happens in the 20th century, and the largest of these peasant armies, Mexico, as we've mentioned, they also existed in parts of Muscovy, former Romanov Empire, and in parts of Ukraine. Along with the national peasant armies comes a new wave, and a truly international wave, of labor militancy. So strikes, the organization of trade unions, the battle to recognize unions occurs, new forms of organizing occur, new forms of industrial union organizing occur, as opposed to the craft structures that existed previously, where a certain group of skilled workers would organize. Now an entire workplace that worked for a company would organize. And these strikes and labor militants occur all across the world, but they're particularly marked in parts of the United States, in Italy, and parts of the British Empire. The other two political innovations of this period, there's an enormous increase in female suffrage, and a number of polities in Europe, Britain, United States, Germany, Austria, Canada, Poland, Sweden, Norway, on and on and on and on. Female suffrage, universal female suffrage, finally becomes part of the constitutional setup, is achieved for the first time. And so there's a dramatic enrichment and expansion of democracy in a number of countries. Not the entire planet, it's only a small minority of the planet can vote at this point, but it's still a very significant step forwards for humanity. Last political innovation we'll mention is the invention of the Leninist party state. I have more to say about that at the very end of this post, but that's a very ambiguous and ambivalent invention. The party state is something that it's actually a way of organizing which will flourish in the global periphery and the global semi-periphery, but not in the core polities for a bunch of interesting reasons. So 3 points about this chapter. The first thing, the uprisings were truly transnational and not really international in the sense of the late 19th century, early 20th century. They were truly a forerunner for many of the things that have been happening since then, in the sense that they were many places. They were seemingly disconnected, but they actually were connected by the movement of people and activists and ideas through the networks of empire. And one of the best descriptions of this was written by the historian Tim Harper, a wonderful text, Underground Asia. And I'll just read from the passage he wrote because it sort of summarizes how this process happened and some of the players behind it. And so he writes, quote, Nguyen Ai Quoc, Ho Chi Minh, so far as anyone could say for sure, was born in 1890, Tan Malacca in 1897, M.N. Roy in 1887. They were among the first to travel in large numbers far beyond their own countries, to meet each other across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and to begin to explore what they had in common. Their itineraries might begin in Saigon, Sumatra, or Kolkata, but they then dispersed across 3 oceans to Tokyo, Paris, Amsterdam, San Francisco, New York, Berlin, and Moscow, before converging again in Asia, in Canton, Shanghai, or Singapore. If the iconic image of this age of travel was the modern splendor of the great ocean liners, these travelers often experienced its underside. Many of them, although not all of them and not all the time, traveled as seamen, laborers, servants, entertainers, students, and, most often, as exiles. They tended to travel light, often under false names and nationalities, with banned literature, illicit currency, or encoded messages hidden in their luggage. They experienced a world of connections, but also a world upside down, the underbelly of the great port cities of empire where they found they were able more freely to organize and act. The sites of their struggles were the waterfront, the lodging house, the coffee shop, the clandestine printing press in the back alley. They made these places centers of global awareness, and their experience of a secret underworld of empire helped shape a spectrum of radical ideas about class, national identity, the position of women, the function of art and literature, the history of the future. Unquote. So you already get a profound sense for these imperial networks, these diasporic networks and maritime networks that are the prelude to the great revolutionary movements of the 20th century, but also to the limitations of these movements. They all emerge in an atmosphere of secrecy, of espionage, of intrigue, political backbuying, of constant, that you were always trying to stay one step ahead of the secret police of any number of empires, and so you tended to use strategies which you could not even begin to call democratic or open to the public. So this tended to generate a political culture of extreme secrecy, extreme authoritarianism, and extremely immune to outside pressure. In other words, not a democratic politics at all, a politics of not necessarily conspirators or conspiracies, but definitely extremely authoritarian and not subject to mass democratic constraints. And this will be a problem for all the movements that come out of this period, and in particularly the Leninist Party state. This will be its Achilles heel. It's able to do certain things because of the secrecy, but it's also this terrible thing because it ends up boomeranging on the instrument of rule. Okay, so there's an issue we'll touch upon in just a second. One of the great consequences of the 1916 and 1922 uprisings, and again, this is something that's very obvious if you sit back and you consider it a transnational phenomenon, and if you just focus on the national, you'll lose sight of this. But step back for a second, see the big spectrum, and you notice that all these things had something in common. They were connected somehow to the rising power of the United States. And the reason was that the United States had become a near peer vis-a-vis Britain during World War I. Okay, it became a net creditor as an economy. It was lending enormous amounts of money to the other members of the Entente. It began to lead the world in all kinds of industries. In industrial production, automobile production, it dominated. Oil production probably accounted for 2/3 of oil production of the world by 1918. It dominated in airplanes and all other forms of high technology. And in Hollywood cinema, film becomes the American art form, and Hollywood films, we think, are roughly between 80 to 90% of all the feature films produced in the world during the early 1920s are produced just by the United States. So this overwhelming economic dominance, and this overwhelming cultural dominance in this new art form of the future, which not even Britain could touch. At the same time, the United States is not a hegemon. It doesn't run the world system, doesn't have a world currency. It's not able to enforce its will. It still has a small army. Its navy is still second rank compared to the British Navy. So there's a huge contradiction there. Okay. Third point that the chapter makes. The chapter zeroes in on these contradictions that I mentioned, that this world of conspiracies and intrigue creates a certain political culture amongst the, expressed most memorably in the Leninist Party state. And there's a great misunderstanding about this period. The great misunderstanding amongst many otherwise well-intentioned observers and intellectuals is to reduce everything to the Bolshevik uprising of November 1917, to call that the revolution and to leave out all the other uprisings and revolutions. That's just not the case. The Bolshevik uprising was just one of 41 total uprisings, and it was just the one that built something called the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, but it was an empire, and it was the second Muscovite empire, essentially. Now, there are a number of texts that I could quote, but for once I'm going to invoke a little, hopefully not go too crazy with quoting myself here, but 2 paragraphs that I wrote explaining why the Leninist Party state went from a very small group of organized folks in 1917 to ruling an entire state and essentially an empire by 1922. What were the reasons for this? How was the party state able to mobilize the people of a former dynastic empire and get them to sign up to their cause, considering there was political competition in the sense that there were other factions in the Civil War that wanted power, and some wanted to restore the monarchy, some wanted a republic, others wanted other things, and so on and so forth. So here's my take on the Leninist Party state. Feel free to disagree, but I've thought a lot about this. So, quote, "On closer examination, all 3 of these tactical reasons for the Soviet Red Army's victory were the local expressions of the strategic reason for its triumph. This latter was imperial continuity. It's true that the party state had promised its constituents peace, bread, and land, while delivering nothing but neo-colonial wars, a devastating famine, and a continental civil war. But none of these broken promises mattered because the party state offered something which a critical mass of the Muscovite heartland, this is the Russian-speaking core which more or less corresponds to contemporary Muscovy, found irresistibly appealing and which no other political movement in that region could match. This was the prospect of a world revolution which was a ruse of Muscovite neocolonial reason." Paradoxical as it sounds, the Leninist Party state was the most radical and yet the most revanchist of the political organizations competing for the allegiance of the denizens of the former Romanov Empire. It was more plebeian than any of its social democratic revolutionary competitors, and yet more dynastic than the Romanov dynasty. It was more pragmatic than any of the Republican movements, and yet more zealous than any confessional community. It was more tactically flexible than any other political faction, and yet more strategically despotic than any of its competitors. It was the most fervently anti-capitalist of all political factions, and yet the staunchest defender of state capitalism, to use Lenin's own term, of them all. Above all, it was more rigorously anti-colonial than any of its competitors, and yet more fervently imperialistic than all of its competitors combined." Unquote. So what explains this massive contradictions? How can a political movement be both progressive and regressive? And the answer is, happens all the time. This happens all the time. Most political movements are a mixture of progress and regress. It's just the polarity is extreme with the Leninist Party state. And the solution to the mystery is actually simpler than you might think. Most denunciations or critiques of the Leninist Party state make the mistake of assuming that it's just like the European fascisms. It's not. It's actually very different. They assume it's just a form of despotism. It's not. What they're mistaking is the colonial element of the Soviet Empire. So the Soviet Empire was not primarily a colonial state. The Roman Empire was straight up colonialism. The Soviet Empire, no. There was plenty of colonialism in the state. But the dominant ideology, the way it thought of itself, the way it portrayed itself, and the way it actually operated was neo-colonialism. Not the standard Romanov colonialism. No, a neo-colonialism based on a very different elite, different structure, different logic. Muscovy 2.0 was a more sophisticated version of colonization and colonialism and industrialization and all these things. And this explains so much of the Soviet Empire and how it was able to actually generate a mass basis of support. Did it ever have true democratic support, as in 51% of the vote? Probably not. That's why it didn't allow elections. But it did generate 30-40% of the population saw some reason to participate in its structures. It offered something to people. It offered the promise of upward mobility, of imperial stability, but also radical change. It offered women the right to dissolve marriages and divorce and have a family structure and to work in factories, while also reassuring men that, yes, your patriarchal authority will still be patriarchal because men were, everywhere at the top levels of the Soviet state. The Politburo were all male. Its leaders were all male, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So both stories were true. So the hard part is there's a massive contradiction, but both stories are true. The party state was both progress and regress in the same frame at the same time, and it used this to gain political power and construct a new kind of neo-colonial empire. That's the basic point. Now, this was very different from the other uprisings and rebellions. In fact, the dominant form of the uprisings that occur, of the 41, the most common form are actually the national uprisings, where a fragment of a former empire wants independence and wants to create its own polity. And this does occur in certain places. Certainly Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Poland all succeed. Other regions of the world do not succeed. And there are echoes of this dynamic in the other parts of the world that experience this. Huge uprising against Japanese colonialism in Korea, just being colonized by Japan, doesn't succeed, but it found seeds and plants the seed for later independent Korea. The Austrian Empire is ripped apart, and new independent states emerge: Czechoslovakia, Hungary, so on and so forth. But the Serbia and Croatia and Slovenia decide to unite to form Yugoslavia, which is this kind of multilingual, multi-ethnic state, and a very interesting, essentially dynastic state. It was actually ruled by a king in 1918. So all of these contradictions are happening, and these movements are extremely ambiguous, many of them, and they create certain potential, progressive potential in some ways and regressive potential in other ways. On the whole, they're probably more progressive than regressive, and they do replace the old empires with new forms of authority. However, they don't resolve any of the underlying problems left behind by the outcome of the war and the fact that the world system doesn't have a hegemon. Britain cannot just run things. And one of the preconditions for this wave of revolts and rebellions, 1916, 1922, is that just after the war, the Entente win the war, but they don't have the resources to actually tamp down or stop many of these revolutions. And the reason is they've been exhausted by the war, they've spent all the resources, the public is tired of fighting, so they demobilize. And that means they don't have the soldiers to put down these rebellions. So the British Empire does not have the tools or the means to stop any of this stuff from happening. The most they can do is send an emissary and try to use diplomacy and so on and so forth. The Americans had the potential muscle but didn't want to use it because they're new to the empire and ruling the world game. That will come later after 1945. So on the plus side, enormous step forwards for humanity and the beginnings of decolonization in its modern form. On the minus side, the stage is also set for a massive episode of regression. And this is the story of the next. We'll stop here, and that'll be the subject of the next chapter.